Yes, Ms. Richards.
So the next document to look at is a letter written by Dr. Jones to colleagues in the northern region on the 26th of May 1983. Seamus, it's PJON 5057_001, please. So we can see it's 26th of May 83. Dear colleague, AIDS and haemophilia. So this is not long after his complaint to the Press Council. I thought I should drop you a note about the present spate of publicity surrounding the acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. As you know, this has been reported chiefly in male homosexuals in the US and also amongst Haitians, intravenous drug abusers and hemophiliacs. There have been sporadic cases in children. Because of the appearance of the syndrome in hemophiliacs, the inference has been drawn that a transmissible agent is at work through blood products and in particular Factorate concentrates from the United States. The transmissible agent is presumed to be a virus and a link has been found with the human T-cell leukemia virus. However, it is not yet known whether the presence of HTLV3 in people with AIDS represents a cause and effect relationship or not. Of HLTV, I should have said, represents a cause and effect relationship or not. It could simply be there as one of the spectra of opportunistic infections. AIDS is being monitored very closely in both the US and the UK. Last week, 14 cases of haemophilia with opportunistic infections have been reported to the Atlanta Centre and 1 to the Collingdale Centre. The indications for reporting are legion because nobody quite knows what makes up the syndrome. Hence, the documents that need to be filled in include all the rarer infectious diseases, all malignancy and all autoimmune phenomena. As an example, we had a case of childhood ITP last year in the Hemophiliac, and information about this has been sent to John Krask, who is coordinating the figures for the Hemophilia Centre directors. Of the 14 American cases, 1 is bisexual and 1 an intravenous drug abuser. The 12 remaining cases all presented with opportunistic infections, and there have been 7 deaths, all associated with PCP. The British case, and this must be a reference to the Cardiff case, to Kevin, has had 2 episodes of oral thrush and 1 episode of orchitis and is getting better. The fact that this adult haemophiliac is said by Collingdale to be a confirmed case is, I think, somewhat suspect. So that appears to be Dr. Jones contemporaneously casting doubt on what Professor Bloom had identified as a probable AIDS diagnosis. I think 3 facts need to be borne in mind when we are advising patients. We go over the page. Firstly, there are 12,000 haemophiliacs in the US and only 14 cases of AIDS with 7 deaths. There are 4,000 haemophiliacs in the UK with only 1 reported case. In neither series of haemophiliac patients has Kaposi's sarcoma been a feature. The incubation period for the transmissible agent in AIDS looks like being around 18 months. If this is true, then even if the agent has been recently introduced, one would expect to see many more cases amongst the haemophilic populations most exposed to factor VIII concentrates from the suspect areas. Typical of these populations are those of West Germany attending the Bonn Centre and those attending the major reference centres in the United States. Thirdly, the effects of withdrawal of factor VIII concentrate treatment for our haemophiliacs would mean the cessation of home therapy and prophylaxis and the withdrawal of elective surgery. The effects of this are obvious. It's worth noting that both measures were in force in the US for some time last year but have now been rescinded, and patients in both New York and California where the measures were implemented are now back on their home therapy programs and elective surgery has been restarted. The Haemophilia Reference Centre directors met in London last week with Peter Hamilton representing Newcastle. At that meeting, it was decided that there were no indications for special measures amongst the UK haemophilic population, apart from stressing the need for very small children under the age of 4, so there is a further reference there to 4 rather than 6 being the cut-off, to be treated with cryoprecipitate in preference to factor VIII concentrate wherever possible. As you know, this does not represent a change in policy. Naturally, careful surveillance of the haemophilic population will continue. I expect you know that the Haemophilia Society issued a statement about AIDS a couple of weeks ago, but I enclose another copy of this for your files. That is presumably a reference to the 4th of May statement issued by the Reverend Tanner, authored by Professor Bloom. All our patients should be in the picture but if any specific queries emerge, please do not hesitate to refer them on if you wish. And then we see below that the list of those to whom this was being sent, and it's effectively the colleagues at all the various associate centres in the northern region.
Do we happen to know where he got his information from, where he said the British case appeared to be getting better?
No, we don't.
The presumption would be, unless there is some material to the contrary, that it must have come from some personal communication with or started by Professor Bloom.
Yes, it would seem unlikely that anyone else would be in a position to have said that. It was Dr. Hamilton who attended the meeting of the Reference Centre Directors at St Thomas's Hospital on the 13th of May, at which Professor Bloom was present. Whether that was the route or not for this, we cannot know, but we do not know otherwise what it was based upon.
Yeah.
And you'll have noted, if we just go up the same page, Seamus, to the top half of the page, that in the third bullet point, it would seem that Dr. Jones is clearly not advising the cessation of home therapy or prophylaxis or the withdrawal of elective surgery. That would appear to be the natural inference from what he says in the letter, because he's suggesting that would be a disadvantage rather than a course to be adopted. There are then two further publications authored by Dr. Jones. The first is, I think, April 1983, PRSE 302723. This is an editorial in the Lancet on the 2nd of April 1983, which it's understood to have been written by Dr. Jones. It doesn't, as is conventionally the case, have a named author. And I just draw attention, it's entitled Acquired Immunodeficiency and Hemophilia. It refers to reports of acquired immunodeficiency syndrome having continued to come in, and the world total now exceeding 1,200. In the second paragraph, it refers towards the bottom of the paragraph to the New England Journal of Medicine and to the suggestions of Jane Deforge in that. And then in the last paragraph, it says this: two aspects of this surge of interest in an as yet unexplained syndrome must at this stage be clearly separated. First, the finding of alterations in lymphocyte populations, although reported as common, may not be causally related. Secondly, the recognition of disease in a few hemophiliacs does not necessarily reflect the tip of an iceberg. Of course, we can expect to see side effects from transfusion therapy with plasma collected from many thousands of donors. But if the explanation of AIDS were that easy, even allowing for a transmissible agent introduced in the late 70s and with a long incubation period, the syndrome would surely have affected greater numbers of either American or West German recipients who received far more Factor VIII concentrate transfusions of US origin than of haemophiliacs in other developed countries. The links suggested by the American workers must be regarded as not proven. Whilst careful surveillance must continue, the reported cases do not constitute a strong argument for a change in treatment policy. Dr. Jones deals with the New England Journal of Medicine and the Deforge suggestion in his statement, but I'll come back to that in a few minutes. One further article authored by Dr. Jones is at HSOC 301285. This is December 1983, the 10th of December 1983, in the BMJ. It's entitled Acquired Immunodeficiency Syndrome, Hepatitis and Hemophilia, and this does bear Dr. Jones's name. starts by saying this: people with haemophilia, their families and their doctors feel threatened by the deluge of speculation about the possible side effects of treatment with blood products. Two topics hold their attention: the risk of contracting AIDS and the risk of developing hepatitis and subsequent chronic liver disease. And then the rest of that column discusses the position in relation to AIDS. If we go to the right-hand column, towards the top of the page, please, we can see, beginning 3 lines down, liver function tests are abnormal in most severely affected haemophiliacs who've had repeated transfusions. The abnormalities are usually intermittent and are rarely associated with any clinical abnormality, though occasionally they may be associated with episodes of overt jaundice, be persistent and be associated with chronic liver disease. And then there is further discussion in relation to that. And then in the next paragraph, Dr. Jones poses the question in the first sentence. So in Britain, where imported commercial concentrates account for 60% of the total Factorate used in 1980, what risk is there of serious harm from haemophilia treatment? And then he refers to a study by Fletcher and others, which showed those receiving National Health Service concentrate developing hepatitis. We pick it up in the bit that's been highlighted on the page. The author suggests that the size of the pool of National Health Service concentrates, over 3,500 donors a batch, has been increased to a point where the benefit conferred by the use of volunteer donor plasma might have been lost. But despite these gloomy figures, the mortality from liver disease remains low, and only 2 British haemophiliacs died from hepatitis between 1974 and 1980. Thus, probably most of the observed changes in liver function represent chronic persistent rather than chronic active hepatitis. And then if we go on to the third paragraph, so if we go a little further down the page. Thank you. The median expectation of life in patients with severe haemophilia in Britain was estimated as near normal in 1980, in contrast to 37 years in 1962. This increase in longevity and the improved quality of life are entirely due to the widespread introduction of Factor VIII concentrates into comprehensive care. So pausing there, you will recall the document I showed you yesterday, in which, in fact, Dr. Jones made that same claim for the introduction of cryoprecipitate. When AIDS was first linked with haemophilia and the extent of the problem in the US was unknown, some centres curtailed planned surgery and home treatment. Nevertheless, most have now reverted to their routine programmes, and throughout the world, the opinion of the majority is that the risk of hemorrhage and its complications far outweighs the risk of developing AIDS or chronic liver disease. For the moment, however, it seems sensible to treat very young, severely affected children with cryoprecipitate rather than concentrates. Alternative methods of raising Factor VIII activity with DDAVP, danazol, or perhaps the new porcine material should be used in mildly affected haemophiliacs, people with von Willebrand's disease and carriers of these disorders. And then he talks about the possibility of using long-term prophylaxis for patients presented with lymphopenia. And then no evidence of causal transmission of casual transmission of AIDS to healthcare staff, although the Americans recommend the adoption of similar precautions to those already in use for hepatitis B when handling specimens from suspected cases. The most important precaution of all, however, is to maintain a high level of surveillance of the haemophilic population. So those are Dr. Jones' reported views at the time. There are then 2 observations about Dr. Jones from one of his peers, Dr. Bolton, which may be worth looking at. The first in time is PRSE 303709. Please show it. This is a memo from Dr. Bolton to Dr. McClelland, dated the 30th of May 1983, subject AIDS. Says this: Dear Brian, just to let you know, I telephoned Peter Jones on 24th of May on the subject of AIDS. I was basically following up what he was claimed to have said on the nationwide programme the previous week about non-rejection of gay donors. He told me what he actually said was that there should be no discrimination against anyone who wished to donate blood, and in particular there should be no questions into their sex lives. However, literature should be provided to include definition of high-risk categories, etc. He went on to tell me that at the recent meeting of the Haemophilia Reference Centre directors attended by his deputy Peter Hamilton, there was quite a lot of discussion around the topic, which I also mentioned in my letter to Arthur Bloom. Incidentally, Arthur also refers to this in his reply to me. Also, he commented to me that in the west coast of the States, the haemophilic community are back on commercial concentrates, and that the burst of cryoprecipitate production at the end of last year was relatively short-lived, i.e. they're back in status quo. He also claimed that there is a lot of doubt about the diagnosis of all the AIDS cases in the UK, and in particular the haemophilics. I felt he was still being somewhat less than cautious in his attitude, but this is not unexpected, given his interests, etc. And then there's a reference to a meeting with Travenol. He also seems to have picked up a somewhat different picture of the Cambridge Travenol meeting than that which you gave to us. I think it's probably a question of his ears being attuned to the only part of the message which Anne Collins would have given him. However, I think it's been useful that we as transfusionists do interact with the haemophilia treating doctors. So there's Dr. Bolton recording his account of a telephone conversation with Dr. Jones. And then if we go to PRSE 306024, please. And this is Dr. Bolton's evidence to the Penrose inquiry. And if we could go, please, to page 36. So we can see a question from the chair referring to an earlier answer by Dr. Bolton, which I don't think I need to take you to, around line 18 or 19, so bottom half of the page. The chair says this: you went on to say there was still a reluctance by some haemophilia clinicians, for example, your good friend Peter Jones, who were anxious to get the balance right. I think that perhaps you didn't explain to me clearly enough what the reluctance was about. I can see the point about getting the balance right, but what was the underlying factor that explained the reluctance? Answer: I would like to put this in the context of my correspondence and telephone calls with Peter Jones, who I regarded as a leading haemophilia director in England and who I knew really quite well. Obviously, it's important to get his own views on this if possible, but at that time, 1982-83, Peter, who was a paediatrician by training and largely dealing with boys with haemophilia in the Newcastle area, really wanted to test the thinking about the nature of this epidemic or looming epidemic that seemed to be focused in America, particularly the West Coast, and how relevant that was to England. I think he was reluctant in drawing too much of a conclusion that would reduce significantly the amount of therapy he could give to his patients. I think it's possibly, particularly because a large number of his patients were boys growing up for whom he felt a personal responsibility to give them a healthy adult life, which was dependent upon ever-increasing supplies of clotting factors. The British, particularly the English, could not meet the demands, and so there was a need to go overseas, particularly to America, where there were products available. And although there were legitimate concerns about the safety of those products, Peter, and many like him, were reluctant to abandon the treatment. In other words, to go back 10 years or so to the style of treatments, usually only cryoprecipitate or small pooled products, which would reduce the dosage that children could get and return them to a risk of getting permanent joint damage from their early years. So that's Dr. Bolton's perspective of the stance of Dr. Jones and other haemophilia clinicians in the early 1980s in response to the risk of AIDS. So still considering knowledge of AIDS and response to it, it is unclear what, if any, changes were made to treatment therapy in Newcastle in response to the growing knowledge of AIDS. I won't go back to Dr. Jones's 1988 letter to Dr. Liam Donaldson that we looked at yesterday, but we saw from the tables of product usage the continuing use of very high quantities of commercial materials. That the table A appended to that letter doesn't show any obvious changes or reduced level of concentrate or commercial concentrate use. There is also, and with one exception, no evidence of deferral of non-elective surgery. There's no evidence of reducing or suspending the home treatment programme or any prophylactic element of it, and no evidence of any reversion to cryoprecipitate. And as I've already indicated, there's no evidence of any kind of policy of adhering to a single type of concentrate. I say with one possible exception because Dr. Jones, if we look at his statement, it's WITN 0841038. Give me one, I just find the right reference. Dr. Jones does make a reference to deferring what he described as cold surgery, which of course now I can't find. I'm sure I'll find it in a moment, but which would not appear to be consistent with what we saw in the contemporaneous documents where he is referring to or seeming to discourage any changes to surgery programmes. If we look at Dr. Jones's statements, and we'll start with the first statement in time. So sorry, Seamus, if we can go to WITN 0841005. And if we go to page 13, question 37, top half of the page, you will see Dr. Jones was asked the question, what, if any, actions did you take to reduce the risk to your patients of being infected with HIV? And the answer is simply heat treatment when it became available. So no other actions there identified. If we then go to his second statement, so that's WITN 0841038. And if we pick it up on page 34, the question 44, starting in the bottom half of the page. He's asked the question when he first became aware of an association between AIDS and use of blood products. Says it's difficult to remember, but would have been UK HCGO or World Federation of Haemophilia. He was then asked if he took any action at that point in time, and he says, I stepped up surveillance and initiated testing as it became available. Patients were kept fully informed at the time. We go to the next page. He was asked if he'd read the Deforge publication in the New England Journal of Medicine. He says this, Deforge article was read and discussed most carefully when it was published in 1983. Pausing there, he doesn't say who it was discussed with, especially with regard to the suggestion that all patients should be switched to cryoprecipitate therapy. That her suggestion was not implemented was due to a number of factors, and then he lists 4. Firstly, the logistics involved in retraining patients and their relatives in home therapy with cryoprecipitate. Secondly, concern with possible secondary infection and allergic reaction. Thirdly, the removal of source material for the manufacture of concentrates. Fourth, the difficulty in treating without knowing the dose. And finally, 5 points, the knowledge that the author did not treat patients with haemophilia and therefore was not in a position to appreciate the consequences of suboptimal therapy. And then he asserts this: in retrospect, we now know that the patients had already been infected before the article was published. Quite what's meant by that is unclear, because, of course, whilst it's no doubt the case that some patients were already infected by that time, it is equally clear that others were not. He then is asked about the San Francisco baby case, and he said he became aware of it from MMWR, and the action was to continue surveillance. He's got no recollection, bottom of the page, to any discussion about the London airport meeting with Dr. Hamilton. If we go over the page, in relation to the reference centre directors meeting of the 13th of May, which was attended by Dr. Hamilton, and he says Dr. Hamilton reported back, he's asked to describe all steps taken in response to the risk of AIDS, and the steps are continued surveillance and treatment of children with cryoprecipitate.
Just
yes.
For a moment, he's used the description of continued surveillance or increased surveillance a number of times. Does he ever define precisely what the surveillance consisted of? And secondly, does he ever say what he thought the surveillance, what good surveillance was going to do in terms of avoiding the risk to the patients?
I think the answer to that is no, but in fairness, yes, I think in fairness to Dr. Jones, I'll double check at the break. I had read that as being a reference to the kind of Dr. Krask-led exercise, because I think surveillance is the term used by UKHCGO in the letters that were sent out from March '83, asking for forms to be completed with suspected cases. But other than that,
the system might be to ensure that information gets to the centre, to where Krask was, so that there could be a proper overview of what was happening across the country, so that, if necessary, further steps could be taken, I suppose. I'm speculating here, I think.
Yes, I equally would be speculating, sir, but I'll double check if there's any further clue in the statements to what Dr. Jones meant by surveillance. He's then asked in the next question whether he told patients about the risk, and he says, we did as they came for follow-up, and via members of the Haemophilia Society. Not quite sure what the latter is a reference to. And then he says, provide full information of the full details of the information given to patients. The information given to patients varied with time and was eventually published in AIDS in the Blood, which was the book that Dr. Jones subsequently published. And then he's asked about the conclusions as set out in the minutes of the Reference Centre Directors meeting on the 13th of May, and asked if he agrees with the various statements set out in the minutes. If we go over to the next page, we can see he says that he does agree did agree with the various statements recorded in the minutes: insufficient information to warrant changing type of concentrate, no clinical benefit to be gained by changing to another type of factor 8. If we look at question little 3, did you agree with the statement that there was as yet insufficient evidence to warrant restriction of the use of imported concentrates? He says at the time, yes, if there was a problem, it was probable that patients had already been exposed, and changed to what product. In retrospect, we know patients had already been infected. So again, there is that repetition of an assumption that all patients had already been infected by that time. He's then asked, bottom of the page, about what was recorded from the Reference Centre Directors of it being circumspect to continue with a policy of reserving NHS concentrates for children and mildly affected haemophiliacs. And he's asked if that was the policy in operation at Newcastle. Over the page, he says yes, and he says we also treated children with cryoprecipitate. And then he repeats the assertion that patients were kept fully informed of developments. He was then asked about the June 1983 general recommendations from Professor Bloom and Dr. Ritzer. He says those recommendations were already in practice. And then we see the bottom of the page, he says, we continue to use cryoprecipitate in children. I think for all the reasons we've already seen, that refers to young children, as in 6 or under 6. At the top of the next page, he suggests that in relation to patients with von Willebrand's, minor lesions, DDAVP or cryoprecipitate, he's asked, did you treat any children with factor concentrates? And he says no, which doesn't appear to be, if we're talking about children 6 or over, it doesn't appear to be consistent with what we've seen elsewhere. And then he's asked about how he became aware of the recommendations of the FDA. Was that explained to patients? He can't recall when he became aware. As already stated, patients were kept informed of all developments. He's then asked, how and when did you first become aware of the Cardiff case? And what, if any, information he provided to his patients about that case? Did he tell them that a patient in the UK, we go to the top of the next page, was suspected to have developed AIDS as a result of blood product treatment? If not, why not? Doesn't answer the question, how and when did he first become aware of the case? He simply says, our patients and us already knew what was happening thanks to media interest. We kept them informed of facts. He was asked then about the letter from Dr. Spencer Galbraith, 9th of May, that we've looked at. He's asked when and how he became aware of it, and then asked to consider Dr. Galbraith's points. And the questions posed, do you agree that each of the points set out in those paragraphs was, on the basis of the information available in May 1983, valid? And his answer is, in general, yes. So he doesn't tell us how and when he first became aware of the letter, but we know, of course, some other clinicians have told us that they were not aware of it at the time, but he is recording there his agreement with Dr. Galbraith's points. He's then, in paragraph 45, asked about any other steps taken in response to the risk of AIDS. And he says, as already stated, we reserved cryoprecipitate for children and mildly affected patients who are not using DDAVP. We continued to use concentrates, including imported concentrates, to treat bleeds. We put off non-urgent surgery. So there's one of the references to surgery. And then he says, whilst I have the reference, if we go forward, please, Seamus, to page 48 of this. Top of the page, he says, we curtailed cold surgery for a time and kept children on cryoprecipitate. Now, that doesn't appear to be consistent with what he has said in publications. We've got no contemporaneous documentary evidence one way or another from Newcastle in relation to the suggestion that surgery was deferred or curtailed. If we could go back, Seamus, to page 40. And he's asked to give a full description. If we just go a little further down the page, in question 45, be a full description of the information which you say was provided to patients. In his answer is just to assert that patients were kept fully informed. And then if we go over the page to page 42, please, Seamus. Question 49, he was asked about whether the patients were informed of the 1 in 1,000 risk. What information were they given? Were they told about dissenting opinions, alternative treatments? And his answer is yes to all. Patients were always told exactly what the state of knowledge was at the time of consultation. The information and the background to that information was reiterated in meetings thereafter. And again, pausing there, I'm not going to go to individual witness statements, but that's not what such evidence as the inquiry has from Newcastle patients. It's not to the same effect in patients' evidence, where it said they were not informed of risks. And then you'll just see he's referred to that memorandum from Dr. Bolton that we looked at a few minutes ago, and asked to comment on it. He says, I've no recollection of the conversation. And then he says, the letter does not make clear whether the author is referring to Arthur Bloom or me. Well, so that's a matter for your interpretation. I think it's fairly clear throughout that he's referring to Dr. Jones, but ultimately that's a matter for you. So that's, I think, I'm not going to go through the entirety of Dr. Jones's statement, but that's the core of what he says in relation to the response to the risk of AIDS. And which brings me to the introduction of heat-treated factor 8 products in Newcastle. Now, at some point in the course of November of 1984, it is clear from the documents that Dr. Jones formed the view that there should be a change to heat-treated factor 8 for Newcastle patients. And we know that because there is correspondence from the 21st of November 1984 onwards from the area pharmaceutical officer referring to Dr. Jones having raised this issue. We won't look at all the correspondence, but if we look at a handful of the relevant materials, PJON 5063 _001, please, Shemik. So this picks things up on the 22nd of November with Dr. Jones writing to the Royal Victorian Infirmary's Administration Department. He says, I've no option but to prescribe heat-treated factor 8, and the Haemophilia Society executive for our region has been told that. The suggestion from one supplier that they would not be prepared to give us credit for existing stock of non-heat-treated material is totally unacceptable. If they persist in this attitude, I've no doubt at all I can persuade them by fair means or foul to change their minds very rapidly. Then there's a reference to finances and potential financial difficulties. And then he says this, one very important point. I have made the decision to change to heat-treated material, not because of the announcement of the death of our patient on the 2nd of November in Scotland, but because of the following recommendations by our American colleagues within the last month. In light of these recommendations, the death of our patient from AIDS has simply accelerated the necessity to reassure other patients and their families as positively as we can. And if we go, he then refers to the statement from the Centres for Disease Control, and then if we go over the page, penultimate paragraph, so bottom half of the page, he says, we will of course continue to do everything we can to keep costs down, but in the absence of response from Elstree until they can get heat-treated material online in April of next year, we have no alternative. Indeed, we might face pressure from some patients not to use the National Health Service product at all. Preliminary and obviously highly confidential work has shown seroconversion in hemophiliacs who have received non-heat-treated National Health Service Factor 8 concentrate prepared from our volunteer donor pools. And that is, I anticipate a reference to what had been learnt in the autumn of 1984 in Edinburgh about infection from Scottish concentrate. There's a further letter from Dr. Jones a few days later, PJON 5061 _001. _27th of November 1984 to Mr. Dowdswell, again from Dr. Jones, and some of it's about costings. I won't go through the details, but halfway down the page, Dr. Jones says, it's numbered paragraph 1, but the second part of that, my present clinical decision is to continue to use NHS material because I consider its potential infectivity to be considerably less than even that of the heat-treated American product. So there seems to be there an intention to continue to use unheated NHS product. If we continue with correspondence chronologically and go to PJON 5069_001, this is a letter dated the 29th of November 1984 from Dr. Jones to Professor Bloom. It seems to be setting up arrangements for or in response to a letter setting up arrangements for the meeting at Elstree on the 10th of December. And then Dr. Jones says this, I have already implemented a change to heat-treated material for this region. We're buying stocks from 3 companies at present, Cutter, Alpha and Armour. All 3 companies have agreed to withdraw their existing non-heat-treated stocks without financial penalty to the health authority. Second paragraph, he says, for the moment I intend to go on using the non-heat-treated NHS product from Elstree. In view of accumulating evidence of possible contamination in both the Elstree and Edinburgh products, I might have to change my mind about this before April, when Richard Lane assures me that heat-treated material will be available from his plant. And then if we can go to the next paragraph, please. He refers then to a meeting with patients. Last night I met with our patients and their families to go over the whole history of AIDS and the apparent low infectivity of the virus. We had a long and amicable meeting and answered a good many questions. I told them that we were implementing heat-treated therapy and also made 2 recommendations in the light of American experience. The first is about wearing gloves, and the second was about the use of condoms. John Krask tells me that they will hopefully soon be in a position to test all our patients for HTLV3 antibody, and the families know that. They also know that they will be told the results. And then if we go over the page, finally a piece of good news for you. We have tested all members of staff here, and everybody is HTLV3 negative. With John's approval, this will be reported in the medical press in the near future. So the testing of staff has taken priority, at least chronologically, over the testing of patients, because the testing of patients had not started at this point in time. Then, if we go, please, Seamus, next to PJON 5067_001. There's a dear colleague letter from Dr. Jones setting out changes implemented for patients, and he sets out there making a change to heat-treated Factorate for all commercial products. Patients who attended the meeting here on Wednesday were told that they should use up their present stocks and that the switch would be made when they returned for new supplies for their home therapy program. So it does not appear that steps were taken to recall product from patients. They were told to use up their stocks and then they'd get their new products when they'd run out. For the moment, we intend to go on using the NHS product from Elstree. And then he refers to the anticipated meeting in Elstree on the 10th of December. He refers to the precautions he's advised in relation to gloves and condoms, and at 4, a recommendation that anybody in the immediate household of somebody with severe haemophilia should refrain from donating blood. And then he repeats the good news of the staff testing negative. If we... I won't take you, Sarah, to the 10th of December 1984 meeting because we've looked at the minutes of that meeting at Elstree on a number of occasions. But if we just look at, it's Dr. Smithers from the DHSS's account of it, just to see what
Before we go there, I wonder if we might just check something.
Yes, of course.
Can we go back to 5061, the 27th of November 84? the letter to Dads, a memo or letter to Dadswell.
That's PJON 5061 _ 001. Thank you, Seamus.
And does he say there that the commercial companies have agreed to take back the product which they had supplied?
Yes, it's he says it on the second page.
Yep.
After the numbered paragraph 6, following our conversation, I rechecked with the representatives of the 3 companies. They have all agreed to take back their present stocks of non-heat treated material without any financial forfeit to the health authority.
So they had agreed to take back all the unheat treated product. It was after that that he has his conversation with all the patients about AIDS, saying, go on using up your unheat treated product, when he could have, without any cost at all to the health authority, it would appear, apart from the additional cost of providing heat treated product, have ensured they had heat treated. If there'd been a recall.
Yes, that would appear to be what the correspondence shows.
The only problem then might be the question of supply, as to which we just know nothing.
Yes.
But the implication of the letter is that there is supply from those 3 suppliers.
Yes.
Yes, thank you.
So just dealing with them, we know the Elstree meeting took place on the 10th of December. And as I say, I won't look at the record that we've looked at on numerous occasions, Mr. Pettit of BPL's record of that meeting. But if we go to DHSC 301117, this is a note from Dr. Alison Smithers of the DHSS to Dr. Abrams about the 10th of December meeting. If we go to the second page, we can see the discussion under the heading Use of Heat-Treated Factor VIII, which Dr. Smithers records. After prolonged discussion, it was agreed that children should be treated with cryoprecipitate or, if necessary, with heat-treated factor VIII. New haemophiliac patients should be treated with a heat-treated factor VIII. It was agreed that it was not proven that heat treatment inactivated HTLV3 and that it was essential for studies to be made of seronegative patients given heat-treated material in order to monitor the efficacy of the heat treatment. Moreover, the virologists considered that there was no evidence that haemophiliacs already HTLV3 antibody positive would suffer if they received further doses of antigen. This view is based entirely on theoretical consideration. Nevertheless, directors felt that they should use commercial heat-treated factor VIII in preference to commercial non-heat-treated factor VIII. Most agreed that untreated BPL factor VIII could continue to be used until heat-treated factor VIII was available from Elstree. There will be some directors who are not willing to do this, notably Dr. P. Jones of Newcastle, who has declared that all patients will have safe heat-treated factor VIII and has already been sanctioned by his district and has already had sanctioned by his district the extra money required to buy the heat-treated product. He will therefore be prescribing commercial heat-treated factor VIII on a named patient basis until the Committee on the Safety of Medicine have agreed to variation of licences. So that's Dr. Smithers' record of what Dr. Jones said at the meeting. There had, in fact, been, prior to Dr. Jones' attendance of the Elstree meeting on the 10th of December, there had been a local meeting, a Newcastle meeting, between Dr. Jones and others on the 4th of December. And we'll just look at that. So it's TYWE 5048. So this is Newcastle District Health Authority report of an ad hoc group to consider the use of heat-treated factor VIII concentrate. And we can see it said that we met on the December the 4th, 1984, to consider the necessity and implications of using heat-treated factor VIII concentrates in treating patients attending the Health Authority's Hemophilia Centre at the Royal Victoria Infirmary. If we go, I won't take you through the entirety of the document, but if we go to the second page, and we look at the first half of the second page, we can see there's a discussion in relation to costs, and if we pick it up about 8 or 9 lines down from the top of the page, the RVI Pharmacy Department, in consultation with the Director of the Hemophilia Centre, have made substantial efforts to obtain commercial factor VIII at the most economic price, but the worldwide shortage of the material does not provide much scope for price negotiation. And then there's a discussion about AIDS. This disease has only been recognised for the past 4 to 5 years. If we go to the next paragraph, 90 individuals are believed to have died from AIDS in the UK, including 2 heterosexual haemophilic patients. Because of the known hematogenous transmission of AIDS, hemophiliacs are at clear and special risk of contracting the disease. 74% of haemophiliacs in the USA, 53% of West German and 34% of London haemophiliacs have antibodies to the putative AIDS virus. It's not known at present what proportion of haemophiliacs attending the Northern Regional Centre have antiviral antibodies, but this information will be available soon. There's no reason to believe that the incidence will be less than that in London haemophiliacs, and we know that 1 patient has contracted the disease in Newcastle. And then if we go to the next page, there's then a discussion under the heading heat-treated factor VIII concentrates. It said a number of manufacturers possess clinical trial certificates for the preparation and administration of heat-treated factor VIII. And then he says the use of heat-treated factor VIII, however, poses 5 potential problems. And then if we look at each of those, the first is that no heat-treated commercial factor VIII is currently available with a product licence, so it'll have to be undertaken on a named patient basis, but it said that informal discussion by one of us with the licensing authority indicates there are no objections to this course of action. The second problem is heat treatment of factor VIII results in some loss of biological activity, but it suggested that in practice such problems have not arisen. The third point is that heat-treated factor VIII from commercial sources costs substantially more than conventional material, and details of the prices are then given. If we go over the page, we see then, and this picks up upon the point that you raised a few moments ago, substantial stocks of conventional commercial factor VIII are held by the authority and by patients in their homes. The stock value of material in the RVI pharmacy, and that's as at the 28th of November, is £33,149. Manufacturers have, however, indicated that they will accept this material for credit or for heat treatment. And then there's a reference to the risks of a world shortage. And then the conclusion and advice is point 1, a change from using conventional commercial factor VIII to using commercial heat-treated factor VIII appears to carry little risk but offer substantial advantages. It should be appreciated, however, that these advantages, though likely, are not proven. We cannot exclude the possibility that even heat-treated commercial factor VIII concentrates do not transmit AIDS. 2, we believe...
It must mean do transmit AIDS.
It must, yes. 2 is we believe on balance that use of NHS factor VIII should be discontinued until after April 1985, when material from this source will undergo prior heat treatment. So it's a temporary discontinuation, as it's put in the end of that paragraph, of NHS material. 3.3 is we advise the continued use of cryoprecipitate. 4, in light of available knowledge, we cannot identify groups of haemophilic patients who would be likely to benefit from heat-treated commercial factor VIII or who would be likely to be at special risk from conventional commercial factor VIII, apart from those without previous exposure to any factor VIII concentrate. 5, in formulating our advice, we've not taken into account the economic consequences of changing to heat-treated commercial material. We believe this decision must be for the authority and its officers. And if we go to the next page, there's then further recommendations if the authority is able to identify funds for the changes. And we can see the participants in that meeting: Professor Michael Rawlins, Professor of Clinical Pharmacology, Dr. Jones, Dr. Madley, Professor Madley, Professor of Virology, Dr. Bird, Consultant Immunologist, Dr. Snow, Consultant Physician in Infectious Diseases, and Mr. Hockley, the District Pharmaceutical Officer. So that was the meeting within the northern region, and funding was indeed made available for the purchase of heat-treated products. We've set out some of the documents and further correspondence in the written note. I don't propose to go to all of them, but we'll just look at one, I think, which is a policy document that was then produced. It's PJON 5065_001. Do you have that? So if we go to the first page, please, Shomik. So we can see AIDS, Newcastle Policy, December 1984. There's a general policy in relation to AIDS. The district AIDS group meets monthly, and it looks like it's going to involve consultants in venereal disease, infectious diseases, immunology, blood product transfusion, and public health. Circular to all doctors out by Christmas via Health Authority. Direct lines communication for referral to at-risk groups established. And then there's a specific, so that's the general policy. Then there's a haemophilia policy. No change therapy except that children not previously exposed to concentrate are being held back on cryo until safer products available. So there is now an express policy to continue children on cryoprecipitate, it would appear, introduced in December 84. 2, all commercial concentrate used to be heat treated. 3, NHS concentrates still to be used, dependent decision this meeting on relevant risk non-heat treated material before April 1985. This appears to predate that meeting, which obviously decided that NHS concentrates were not going to be used. But in any event, there's then a recommendation of wearing gloves, recommendation in relation to use of condoms, avoiding blood donation, and then at 7, all patients to be HDLV3 antibody tested, results to be released to families, staff already tested for HDLV3 antibodies, and then over the page, no precautions needed in everyday life, regular meetings with Haemophilia Society executive and members, clinics set aside to discuss AIDS in privacy for anyone who wants to attend, contact tracing and follow-up of at-risk partners of AIDS patient in progress, meeting with union reps, safety officers, junior doctors, technical staff when AIDS case reported in media. If we look at the date at the very bottom of the letter, it's actually dated the 7th of December, which postdates the meeting of the 4th of December, obviously. So the position in relation to NHS concentrates is set out in this document doesn't seem entirely to reflect what was decided at the meeting. But leaving that aside, that's the AIDS policy, and there are letters which communicate that to clinicians at the Associate Haemophilia Centres on the 13th of December 1984. we'll just go to that. I think it's PJON 5066_001. No, that's... Oh, yes, so that's the letter. Sorry, it's not the one I was thinking of, but that's the letter enclosing the policy document. But the letter... we look at PJON 5068_001. Please, Shomik. Yes, that's the one. So it's the 13th of December. Dear colleague, I enclose a summary of the policy that I've adopted for patients with haemophilia attending this centre. All the points on it were discussed at length with the reference centre directors and representatives of the blood transfusion services, etc., etc. One or two points need further explanation. My decision not to continue to use the NHS concentrate is based on knowledge that seroconversion to HTLV3 antibody positivity has been carefully recorded by the director in Edinburgh on patients using the Scottish NHS Factor 8 concentrate. There is evidence that at least 2 batches of the Elstree product were compromised following donation by a donor with AIDS. And then he says this: we shall use up our present stock of NHS on patients already exposed to the relevant batch. Our quota of NHS product will then be stockpiled at Elstree to await heat treatment from April 1985. And then the next point refers to factor 9. He says, I'm unhappy at using commercial heat-treated factor 9 concentrates because all the evidence is that they're far more likely to cause thromboembolic complications than the non-heat-treated NHS material. However, the latter is known to have caused seroconversion, will almost certainly be forced to use heat-treated material in 1985. Before doing so, I intend to await the results of thrombogenicity testing at Elstree, in the belief that the risk from these other complications outweighs the risk of AIDS from factor 9 concentrate. And then there's reference to precautions in relation to gloves. And then if we go over the page, we can see it said, third line down, we've obtained facilities for testing all our patients and their immediate partners for HTLV3 antibody with Dr. John Crask in Manchester and Dr. Richard Tedder in London. Finally, we are endeavouring to contact all general practitioners known to have at-risk patients on their lists. The nature and extent of that contact with general practitioners is not currently clear, whether it was general or specific in relation to individual patients. So there are a handful of other letters we've referred to in our written note on this issue, but those, I think, are the key ones in relation to the introduction of heat-treated concentrates in the Newcastle region. I want to turn next then to the process of testing patients for HTLV3. I've already indicated that the evidence shows staff being tested before patients. In terms of the process for testing patients, we can, I think, perhaps most usefully pick up Dr. Jones's account of that from his evidence to the Lindsay Tribunal. So LIND 40312, showing it. And if we go to page 14, we can pick it up halfway down the page, so the bottom half of the page. He's asked about the total number of patients who were found on testing to be HIV positive, and he says, we tested 143 people who had been multi-transfused, and of those, 99 were found to be HTLV3 positive. Of the people with severe haemophilia A, 76 people. And then he's asked about the process of testing. We started testing December 84/January 85, and the results reported in this paper, I'll look at the paper in a moment, were complete by May of 1985. How did you organise the sort of system? He says 143 we tested. We also tested members of staff. There were 68 members of staff as well. And so he's asked more about how that was organised. Bottom of the page, he says, we worked with Dr. Richard Tedder, and he very kindly agreed to test patients' bloods in his laboratories in London. And then as it became available, Dr. Arthur Codd, who was a member virologist working with the Public Health Laboratory Service at the General Hospital in Newcastle, set up the procedures to test patients there. We had a questionable result. We always checked it with the other laboratory. So the laboratory side of it was evolving. We used this right from the beginning. And then he talks about we got on with it and tested people, told them the results as they came through. And then he was asked how that was done. He says they would be invited to have their blood tested. And then the blood would be sent off to one of the laboratories. When the result came through, these people would be invited back again and the diagnosis would be given to them. He's asked how was that done, and he says most of them were in and out of the hospital very, very frequently at that time because they wanted to know what the results were and what the implications were. At the minimum, people were followed up every 3 months anyway because of their haemophilia. So the maximum time between taking blood and getting the result, if they just went for follow-up, was 3 months. And so the question was asked, if somebody didn't happen to come into the centre in that 3-month period, would they be sent for or contacted by the centre to be told that the test is now, that there is a result from the test? Answer, it depended very much on the family and what we knew of the family and the people concerned. At one extreme, there was one young man who did not want to know his result, and even by the time I left, did not want to know his result. And at the other extreme, there were people who were practically living in the centre, wanted to know what the results were as soon as they became available. In general, people either came in to see a sister or rang up and said, is the result available yet? And sister would say, would you like to pop in and see me? But invariably, that result was always given within the centre to the people directly. And then the questions asked about somebody giving a sample and their next appointment being 3 months hence at the next routine appointment, and if they hadn't contacted the centre in the intervening period, when would they have been told of the result? Answer, at 3 months when they came in for follow-up. So the question then again, what would happen would be it would be left to the next routine visit. And Dr. Jones says, yes, that was pretty rare at the time. He describes that as the long stop. Whilst we have this document open, if we go to the next page, he then distinguishes that from the testing with hepatitis C. And if we pick it up about 6 lines down, would I understand that there was a difference between telling persons of a positive HIV antibody status and telling persons of a positive hepatitis C antibody status? Obviously, that was several years later. And Dr. Jones says, yes, there was a difference in terms of urgency of telling the result. The reason for that was that at that time, HIV was considered to be such a devastating diagnosis that we had to get on with it. With hepatitis C, we already knew we were dealing with a long, drawn-out disorder, at that time thought to be perhaps 40 or 50 years before there was any overt sign of disease. So there was not the urgency of divulging the result to people. Question, would I understand from your statement in the case of hepatitis C that the telling of the diagnosis was in fact left to the next routine visit by the patient? Answer, yes it was, unless they wanted it earlier. Question, was considered less threatening than the diagnosis of HIV? Considered less threatening by whom, Dr. Jones? Answer, by the patients and by us. And then he says the reason for that was this chronicity or assumed chronicity of the disorder. HIV carried with it from the very early days a death threat which was pretty immediate, whereas hepatitis C was more likely to be a prolonged course before any overt disease became evident. Question, would there be on occasion, particularly perhaps in relation to hepatitis C, would there be patients who wouldn't attend at their regular review appointment? Answer, oh, of course. And if we skip over a question and answer, Dr. Jones is then asked, and so what happened if somebody didn't attend for a scheduled review appointment? Answer, then we tried to chivvy them up. Most of the people who were hepatitis C infected were people who had been multi-transfused. Again, and so they had to come in to get their supplies of treatment anyway. Most of them would be on home therapy. and at that stage, time would be found to tell them what the diagnosis was. So that's Dr. Jones's description. It's not entirely clear how people were selected for testing, because we have some evidence from individual patients which seems to suggest a mild haemophiliac, for example, being tested in January of 85, a severe haemophiliac only being tested in May of 1985. We also have, if we look at HSOC 0023206, I think, I'm afraid I can't read my own handwriting. Yes, HSOC 0023206, please, Shane. This is a document from the Haemophilia Foundation of Australia. If we go to page 3, we can see it records visits under the heading British visits to British haemophilia treatment centres. If we go over the page, we can see there's a description of a visit to the Royal Free, and then if we go to the next page, a visit to Cardiff, and if we pick up the bottom of that page, there's a visit to the Royal Victoria Infirmary in Newcastle. It said, you probably all heard Sister Maureen Ferns and Dr. Peter Jones speak, read their written material and possibly met them personally too. Very articulate, high-profile pair. They head up a professional team, etc., etc. We go over the page. It says, the team was particularly taken up with AIDS problems when I was there, being quite shattered by the deaths they had had, each patient being like a friend. They support each other and receive great support from the patients and society members. And then this, as in Wales, patients are tested for HIV antibody as they come to treat. Many mild/moderate people still untested. And the date of this publication is January 1987. Don't have the actual date of the visits, except that they were made in the course of 1986. Suggestion there that testing of mild and moderate patients was still being undertaken in the course of 1986. In terms of, we've seen when patients were told, according to Dr. Jones in his evidence to the Lindsay Tribunal. How they were told is, first of all, there's a brief description in Dr. Jones's second statement, WITN 0841038. No, sorry, that's the wrong reference. Can we go to PJON 5031_001? It's not Dr. Jones' statement, it's one of his reports to the Lindsay Tribunal. So this is a report on the response of staff at the Newcastle Haemophilia Centre in order to help people with HIV infections by Dr. Jones. If we go to page 6, please. Under the heading Telling the Patient, this is Dr. Jones' description of what he says was the procedure that evolved in Newcastle and was used whenever patients had to be told results from investigations that might be upsetting, for example, a diagnosis of haemophilia or an HIV antibody positive result. And then he contrasts that with testing for hepatitis C and says at the time of testing for hepatitis C, an antibody-positive result was considered less threatening than these diagnoses and was given in the privacy of a follow-up clinic, although when appropriate staff were ready to follow the procedure. And then the procedure for what he described as upsetting diagnoses of haemophilia or HIV, a senior doctor would give the result in the privacy of a consulting room. The haemophilia sister or her director would be present. The setting was as informal and non-threatening as possible, no restriction on time, telephones in the room diverted, implicit permission to cry. At all times, patients attending the centre were encouraged to bring partners, parents or friends with them. Parents of young children were seen alone, the child being distracted in the centre. No hard and fast rule about telling older children/adolescents because individual circumstances were so variable. In general, parents would be told first when children were under 16. Over 16-year-olds were always encouraged to have parents with them during the consultation. Once the diagnosis had been given, immediate concerns were answered briefly, and then the family would be left to themselves with the door shut for a few minutes. The nursing staff would then take them a cup of tea or something stronger and sit with them if they wished. The doctor would then see them again. Any further immediate questions were answered. They were reassured as much as possible. Any myths surrounding the diagnosis were dispelled. They were then given the opportunity to sit and talk for as long as they wished in sister's office or with one of the social workers, etc., etc. Says the family doctor and local haemophilia centre director would be informed. That's presumably a reference to associate centre directors. Doesn't say one way or another whether that was with the advanced consent of the patient. Top of the next page. When appropriate, a social worker and or sister would arrange a home visit within a week or so. A follow-up appointment also be given to the family. The centre had an open door policy. Patients and families knew they could come in or phone at any time without an appointment. When appropriate, patients or family members would be encouraged to talk with others who'd been in the same predicament and to join a lay society coping with the problem, for instance, the Hemophilia Society. The term procedure for all this is probably too strong to describe what actually happened, because whatever the diagnosis, every opportunity was taken to keep the consultation as informal as possible. At times, the best thing to do was get out of the hospital and go for a walk in the park with the patient and his or her relatives. So that's Dr. Jones' account in his report to the Lindsay Tribunal of how he and his team at the centre went about notifying patients of their results. So I note the time. Is this the right moment for a break?
Yes, it is. Well, we'll take a break now, shall we, until 3:45.
Thank you, sir.
3:45.